Morning, evening, good afternoon from wherever you're joining us. This is the Africa E-Mobility Week. We're excited to continue the discussions today. Yesterday we spoke quite a lot around the PIGO models, about technologies, about charging infrastructure for electric vehicles, and today we're still discussing things charging infrastructure. We have an exciting panel for you this morning. Experts from across different parts of Africa with different sort of experience across the value chain. Before I hand it over to the moderator of the day, I'd also like to pass a hearty thank you to all the partners who've worked with us this journey in setting up this e-mobility week. So thank you to EV Charger, to the Waterfront Mall, to Untapped, to the Standard Group. Thank you to the ABSA Group, Kenya National Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Thank you to United Nations Environment Programme. Thank you to Vile Group through UTU. And a big thank you to the World Resources Institute for making all this possible. So we'll dive right into the session. I'll now hand it over to our moderator of the day.
Thank you very much. I welcome everyone to this session. I think we will jump right into it. I think the first few 2 minutes will be more or less like just shaping what this discussion will be about. The global drive towards electric mobility has been enhanced by, for instance, in other parts of the country, banning of internal combustion engine purchases and imports, and also shifting of consumer behavior. Not forgetting improvements in battery and charging technology. The major players in the market globally, like the USA, European Union, and China, are expected to sell one electric vehicle by 2035. This is according to McKinsey & Company. And by 2050, 80% of global vehicle sales are expected to be electric. So Africa shouldn't be left behind, even as this electric mobility transition shapes off. Then the question that is key to answer then is, can Africa keep up with the rest of the world? When riddled with low electrification rates, affordability challenges, weak regulations, and also the dominance of used and efficient low-emission standard vehicles. You see? So keeping this discourse in mind, this session is meant to contextualize the pitfalls impeding deployment of electric vehicle infrastructure in Africa. Therefore, it will also ride on lessons that can be learned from the global north, pioneering countries in the global south, and also the Asian markets. And how Africa can actually leapfrog the electric transition by leveraging opportunities across the entire electric infrastructure value chain. I think that shapes up the introduction in this regard. At this point in time, I think I'll invite the panelists to more or less like do their 5-minute presentation each. I think the first person to go is Mr. Yadi. Mr. Yadi, the floor is yours. Mr. Yadi, am I audible enough? Maybe I'm not. Oh, okay, great.
Yadi, you can unmute yourself. I think you're still muted.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Yeah, we can hear you. So 5 minutes or less.
Okay, no worries. Good morning. So my name is Yadi, Omurembe Yadi. I'm the CEO and founder of EV Charger. So we operate here in Kenya. So it's just a short presentation about our company and our goals and what we've been through so far to date. So EV Charger, we started it in 2020, the end of 2020. And, you know, the main objective was to just solve the problem of charging infrastructure here in Kenya. Like our, also saying that we do believe that e-mobility is the future. And Kenya, in the region of East Africa, we think we can be the front runners in the adoption of e-mobility here. And also, e-mobility has huge benefits in combating, global what's called climate crisis and the global warming that's sort of going through right now. So we have a few charging stations set up. We have 4. We have at Two Rivers Mall in Nairobi and Waterfront Karen, where we will be, with so IMDA is where we're holding the e-mobility exhibit, 29th of October, this weekend. We have a City Mall Nyali, Mombasa, and we've just installed Sportsman's Arms Hotel next to Barabarito Restaurant in Nanyuki. So far, the challenges that we see in e-mobility in Kenya is just, the lack of government support. They've tried a bit with a reduction in excess tax for importation of cars to EV cars rather to 10%, but we would like a little bit more. Also, the slow movement of the EV market growth. I guess within Africa, it's growing a bit faster in Europe and in the USA, but in Africa it's a bit low. And just getting good charging locations so far. Of course, opportunity is almost the opposite. We hope for better government support, and I think with our current president, it was in one of his memorandums. So we hope that that's enacted through education and staff of the public. We hope also that there'll be a bigger adoption of electrical vehicles, and just collaborating with all other players in the market. We hope that will move this movement forward. So part of our team, we have Joseph Kahudzia. He has a PhD in physics, and he's a writer Clean Technica, which is like a website about renewable energy, e-mobility. Our chief engineer is in a similar field, and he has 17 experience in electric engineering and solar renewable energy. We have Aliyah Yamani. She's experienced in this similar field. We have a great team, and so she's experienced in environmental issues and sustainable sector, carbon credits. And Khadija Abu, who's experienced in project management and a strong technical background in e-mobility. And myself, I'm Iyadi. I'm in the aviation field, and how I got into this industry of e-mobility is I just bought an electric car and I just saw a lot of
just a quick one, Mr. Iyadi. I think time is running out. You can just maybe speed it up.
Yeah, I'm finished. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Iyadi, for that awesome presentation. I think our next presenter is Mr. Daniel. Mr. Daniel, the floor is yours. Just be mindful, you only have 5 minutes or less.
See, I shared my screen. I don't know if you can see the screen.
I can see it from my end. You may proceed.
Great. So my name is Daniel. I work with growth and expansion with Metro Africa Express. So Max is a vehicle subscription company. By vehicle subscription, what we mean is that we offer drivers in Africa a chance to subscribe so they can have access to a vehicle. And with that comes on add-on services like vehicle insurance, health insurance, field support, and maintenance. And we are using this to deploy e-mobility into Africa because we believe that e-mobility is the future. Like we said, Africa can teach the world how to transition from fossil fuel into renewable energy. Just because, as you can see, the price of fuel is rapidly rising and it's not going to stop. So some research that we did, backed by the Africa Development Bank, that 90% of commercial drivers in Africa are underserved. And this is part of our model where we're trying to serve drivers, especially the two-wheeler drivers, but mostly three-wheelers, four-wheelers drivers that are excluded from the financial system. And we know that most of this equipment that we use is not also manufactured in Africa, so that also provides a challenge in terms of insurance or OEM support. And also, we know that especially in the rural areas, same for the cities, it's different, but in the rural areas, almost half of the residents there do not have access to reliable transportation. So with Max, what we have done is we have provided access to vehicles, and by access to vehicles, what we mean is that we provide access to financing, right? So you can come to us, we'll give you a vehicle financed, you pay us a fee daily or monthly, but it's not, we don't call it, installment. It's a subscription fee that gives you access to all of the services that I've mentioned before. But with that as well, we also are innovating, and we're building an electric vehicle that we've really built from scratch. We think that that's the first fully African-built motorbike or two-wheeler that has been tested in the rough terrain in rural areas. We've gone through 3 generations of it, as I'll share in a few minutes. We started with the M1, and then we went to the M2, and M3 now has modern technology. It's integrated into a seamless battery swap system, and it's ready to take on the urban city terrain, but has been really tested in the rural terrain. It's really rough and tough, and the range is competitive globally. So like you see here, just to quantify the challenge that we have in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions, what will contribute to greenhouse gas emissions would be the two-wheelers. I don't know if you've visited Kampala. I'm currently in Kampala, and you look at the streets, it's a swarm of motorbikes. And if you've visited Nairobi, let's say you go to a town like Kakamega, and you look at the streets, or you go to Bungoma, you look at the streets, it's a swarm of motorbikes. So those are contributing more greenhouse gas emissions than even the four-wheelers, than the diesel trucks. So we believe that starting by electrifying the two-wheelers, we can be able to reverse the challenge of the greenhouse emissions, but also that helps us.
Sorry, just a quick one, Daniel.
Yes.
You've run out of time. Maybe you can just wind up.
Yeah. So just yeah. Actually, I'm actually done. I was just going to quantify the challenge, and looking at how we can, sometimes others might want to focus on manufacturing the chassis. Others might want to innovate on the battery, and others might want to put together like EV charger here in this panel. Want to put up charging infrastructure. And I think it's important that all of these mobility solutions that is that is solving the climate challenge that we're having. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Daniel, for that awesome presentation. At this point in time, I'll call on Felix and Jeremy to give us their 5-minute presentation. I think they'll try to align business models such as battery swapping and how they can be synergetic with the EV infrastructure. Felix, you may proceed.
Just checking you're able to see the presentation now.
I think it's loading.
I can see.
Yeah, you see the presentation.
Now you can.
Fantastic. My name is Felix. Coming here from ArcRide, I'm joined by Jeremy. We'll go into introductions in a minute. Just as a broad overview of ArcRide, we're an electric vehicle and infrastructure company. Today, we wanted to focus on battery swapping infrastructure, specifically for the purposes of this webinar. So my name is Felix. I'm head of sustainable growth here. I've been part of ArcRide since its foundation from day dot, and part of the Kenyan operations since we started in January 2021. Among other things, I'm working on a CO2 offset program, which are sort of data telematics from our vehicles, and a whole ecosystem is very crucial to achieving. Looking forward to speaking more about ArcRide's battery swap ecosystem today and answering all the questions.
Hi everyone, my name is Jeremy Kimball, mechanical engineer by training. I'm the ecosystem manager at ArcRide. I joined in 2020, just before operations started in Nairobi. Our ecosystem consists of 48-volt batteries, and in terms of the ecosystem, we have the batteries, the vehicles, the battery swapping lockers, and all of our apps and management platforms. In terms of the team here, we have a team here with mostly electrical engineers and solar technicians who are doing the installation and management of the app and the ecosystem.
Great. So essentially, our great innovation or what we're bringing to the table is a 48-volt system and its battery swap system. The reason we're wanting to do that is we want to mirror the Asian market. And now in Africa, we have a few extra challenges to the Asian market, but that's fine. Crucially, we're going to be owning the infrastructure ourselves. That's batteries, the swap lockers, and the app, of course. And the vehicles will be sold to riders themselves. I'll now pass over to Jeremy to talk about some of the reasons we're opting for a 48-volt system over a larger battery and a larger voltage.
Yeah, as Felix mentioned, we're looking to mirror some of the companies like Gogoro in the Asian market. We've identified that a 48-volt battery is able to have a smaller battery compared to the 72-volt, which makes it easier for swapping and allows us to automate our system, whereby we don't need an attendant to be able to assist the riders while they're swapping. We're currently doing a rollout of a pilot swapping infrastructure, which consists of a 51.2-volt battery and a slightly larger cabinet. We're going to begin the rollout of the version 2, which is the 48-volt battery. This will be around half the weight, like being 13 kgs, and in terms of the size, it will also be around half of the size, but there will be minimal loss to the range that the vehicles are able to achieve. With the version 1 being able to do around 70 kilometers, the version 2 will be doing 50 kilometers, but due to the reduction in size, we'll be able to fit 2 batteries into the vehicle. In terms of safety, we've looked to prioritize that as a company, and one of the things we're doing in terms of the cabinet is making sure that the cabinets have inbuilt firefighting capabilities. We make sure that they're properly earthed when we're doing the installation to minimize the risk of electrocution, and all of the systems have flood protection to minimize and cut off from the mains whenever a certain level of water is reached. In terms of the chemistry for our batteries, we chose to go with LFP as opposed to NMC. This is mainly due to not being involved with conflict minerals. LFP has a longer life cycle, which means that the batteries are able to be in the ecosystem for a longer period of time. And we're also looking at the full life cycle of the batteries, being able to repurpose the cells for use with solar applications once they've reached the end of their life cycle in our ecosystem.
And as you can see here on the right, this is one of our swap lockers. On the top is a solar panel, so they're fully compatible with solar as well, whether that's on-site solar or one connected directly to the swap locker. Just to run you quickly through the process of a battery swap, a rider will have a battery serial number in their vehicle, and they'll take the app.
Sorry. Quick one, Felix. I think you're ending up now. 5 minutes is up.
Yeah. In the swap process, it's very quick and straightforward. A rider will go up and scan the QR code, as you can see in the top right-hand corner of the swap locker. That will pop open an empty locker. The rider will put their depleted battery inside. Once connected and closed, spare locker with a fully charged battery will pop open. The rider will put the locker in their vehicle. Once connected, it will display on the app that they've completed the battery swap, and they're able to then ride off with a fully charged battery again. Thanks very much for listening to our presentation. Looking forward to the conversation now that will proceed.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that great presentation. I think at this point in time, we'll check up some poll questions. I think I'll ask Warren to facilitate that. I think this should take approximately 3 minutes.
Okay, great. We have a couple of questions to the audience. And the first one is, how can governments, development partners, and private sector stakeholders build an enabling environment for the electric vehicle charging infrastructure in Africa? Now, this is a question that's posted to all the attendees. So feel free to respond on the chat section. I'm just posting it there. The question is, how can governments, development partners, and private sector stakeholders build an enabling environment for electric vehicle charging infrastructure in Africa? The second, Mbuso, should I go to the second question?
I can proceed. You can go to the second question. I think the audience is expected to start thinking through the questions. Later, we're going to have a session where we'll discuss the responses from the audience. So even the audience is free to even respond in the chat on how they think we can actually respond to this and shape the electric mobility transition for Africa. So you may proceed with the second question.
The second question to the audience and to the panelists as well is, what should come first between electric vehicles or charging infrastructure in the electric mobility transition? I've just added it to the chat section. What should come first between electric vehicles and charging infrastructure in the electric mobility transition on the continent? See, responses already trickling in, but I'll hand it over to you, Kumbuso.
Okay, thank you very much. I think the other interesting bit that we can actually pose there, the third poll question in this regard would be, I think from the introduction, you notice that I think in a couple of years from now, the global north, the key players like China, European Union, the United States of America will put a ban to selling of internal combustion engines vehicles. So now the question is, will Africa be a dumping ground for this? So how can we as Africa prepare to ensure that we coin a sustainable future for ourselves? Okay, that's the third question. So thank you for that. I think the next, we'll now move to the Q&A, where we will now start engaging with the panelists, where each panelist will be asked a question, then they can more or less like shed light based on their experience and the way they see fit. I think then the last two questions will be open to the audience. So I think I'll say it when it's time for the audience to ask a question. But in the meantime, just take some notes, and as we more or less like have this interesting discussion with the panelists. Okay, so the first question goes to Mr. Ayadi. From your experience, what are the drivers of perceived future increase in electric vehicle fleet and consequently charging infrastructure deployment in Africa? What do you think will drive electric vehicle and charging infrastructure in Africa? I think you're muted.
The most important thing is, regulation. Government support is the biggest thing that can, boost e-mobility in Africa. Once you have government support, like you see that in the West or in Europe or in Asia, where you have grants, reduction in tax and all that, that really drives people to buy electric vehicles because it's cheaper. So if you see like a country like Rwanda, where, if I'm not wrong, importing electrical vehicles has zero tax, and importing the charging infrastructure has zero tax. So it just creates an environment, even in Rwanda, where people would private sector people would invest in infrastructure, and people would buy the vehicles. That, as well as just educating people in terms of how beneficial in mobility electric vehicles are. All that just comes around full circle, and like you see that what has happened in US and Europe and in Asia, it's really boosted e-mobility. So it all starts with regulation.
Thank you very much for that. I think the next question goes to Daniel. What are the challenges faced in Africa in the EV infrastructure space? What lessons can Africa learn from the rest of the world? Also, case in mind the safety aspects as well of setting up infrastructure. Daniel, you may proceed.
Yeah, in our experience, the biggest challenge is the reluctance of the private players to move in and set up the infrastructure, because nobody wants to go in first. It's very expensive, and making profits come in very far ahead, right? You're looking at looking at making profits 10 years down the line. So if you're gonna build let's say a charging station right now, it's gonna be old model, old generation. By the time the new ones are coming, so everybody's waiting for the cheapest, latest, and nobody wants to burn their fingers. Government regulation, while it's been interacting Governor of Nairobi and the regulatory sector in Kenya, there's a lot of intent, but sometimes we can put intent on the table and eat it, right? You have to follow intent with action. So there's been a slow action, I must say, by the government side in putting together an electric charging infrastructure. Like you've seen before, it was a chicken and egg problem. But I think the first one that must come is the charging infrastructure. Like we've seen lessons from what Tesla did. They just decided at one point to ramp up the charging infrastructure across the US. And we've seen what Asia has done as well. Government first, ramping up the charging infrastructure, and then it makes it easier for players to move in. But let me just pause here and say one thing, that what we are doing in this industry, right, currently, I've seen there's a big move to start with the two-wheelers and to start with the buses. This is moving in with the public transportation. That's critical, because then it forces the government to move in as well in the public interest to set up the charging infrastructure. And so when the charging infrastructure reaches a critical point, then we can see private players coming in and introducing four-wheelers and two-wheelers for private use. But again, the challenge basically is that there's the reluctance in capital investment, reluctance for partners to work together. Everybody wants to do it on their own. Everybody wants to do everything. One player wants to put on the charging stations, the battery. They want to manufacture the batteries and also manufacture the chassis. And at the same time, other players are saying, hey, you know what? I'll just hold up. I'll hold up and wait. And at the same time, the government is also saying, you know what, let's focus on other priorities first. Let's focus on other climate priorities first. And this charging infrastructure thing, we'll wait it out, and the private players will come in and support it. So those are our experiences so far. I hope that with conversations like this, we'll try and bring in more stakeholders to collaborate and to identify the quick wins to move electric mobility forward.
Thank you very much for that, Daniel. The next question goes to Felix and Jeremy. What are some of the lessons that Africa can adopt from the Asian market in our quest to leapfrog the electric mobility transition?
Yeah, so I think it's really important that we are mirroring the Asian market as a company, because I think, if we compare Nairobi as a city and extrapolate that to East Africa and other urban centers in the region and in sub-Saharan Africa, we're far more like Asia was 20, 25, 30 years ago than another European city, like I'll use the example London, my hometown. So London, has had a formal public transport system since the 19th century. So it's far, far, far beyond where a lot of these other cities were in Asia, for example, in the 20th century. And then if you look at the model of Gogoro in Taiwan, people have essentially had to use their own personal transport, personal mobility, so small two-wheelers transporting themselves, commuting to and from work, and that's kind of been the dominant mode of transport that's needed to happen. And I think Africa and Nairobi, as an example, is in much a similar position right now. So I think what we need to do is build a battery swap infrastructure, build an infrastructure that works for personal mobility, for small-scale personal mobility, because frankly, the public transport sector is not quite there. It'll take a long time to get as developed as it is in some of these other countries. So I think, looking at the Asian market as where we should be targeting is perhaps the most realistic and most accurate to where Nairobi and other cities are at the minute.
And I think just from a technology standpoint, it needs to be a place where we go automating more of the swapping infrastructure more. I think that allows it to be more, user-friendly, and allows the users to not have to deal with any other person when they're doing the swapping. And I think also the majority of the companies in Asia are transitioning to LFP, which I think would, as Africa, if we start adopting LFP as the battery standard, I think that would help us leapfrog or give us a leg up on some of the other countries that are looking to transition.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. I mean, we have the opportunity to learn from the mistakes, learn from the challenges that other markets have faced, particularly in Asia, and some that have been very similar to us in terms of their constitution. And so let's leverage that. I think there's also, of course, like there's a market and there's a need for charging infrastructure for larger vehicles. I think the focus right now for us, for the majority of people, should be on smaller scale, more affordable modes of transport.
Okay. Now, thank you for that. Insightful responses. The next question goes to Ayadi. I think the transport sector in Africa more or less takes up about 10% of the greenhouse emissions, with comparison to the total emissions in Africa. So don't you think it would be more or less impractical for us to be talking about climate change as Africa, saying that we're not emitting much? What are your thoughts in this regard? Do you think climate change mitigation should be the driver of electric mobility? Vis-a-vis, we know that we have issues of attaining sustainable development. We have issues of low electrification access. What are your comments on that? I think you are muted.
Yeah, I'm sorry. My opinion is, I don't think climate change should be the main issue, the main reason to adopt e-mobility in Africa, but it's definitely a benefit. I can speak mostly for the countries I've visited in Africa, and of course about in Nairobi. There's a lot of traffic. You'd find the air is not that clean. There's a lot of smoke, fumes from exhaust and all that. So I just imagine a future where at least even half of the cars on the road are electric, just from personal, just views, like the air would be cleaner. How do I explain this? So the air will be cleaner, it improves your own health and all that, citizens' health. So, for example, like my reason that I went to electric was more about the cost of ownership of a gas car. So just, and in terms of what you were asking before about the power availability in African countries, it's improving. I remember when I was growing up, in Kenya, we used to have power cutouts. We used to have rationing. But now in Kenya, you rarely have power cutouts unless it's a system failure. We have an oversupply of energy, and most of it is renewable. So I can speak mostly about Kenya, and I think Kenya, that's why I feel like we can be the forefront, because we have everything set up in terms of power, to just encourage people to buy more electric vehicles and e-mobility.
No, thank you for that. Thank you for that insightful response. I think the next question goes to Daniel. Daniel, what incentives are required in the EV infrastructure space in Africa, from your experience?
Right. I think the incentives, Rwanda can be a model for what has been a really just a overall collaborative and pleasant experience for clean energy by, and lowering the taxes and duties for importing electric mobility, not just equipment, but also the other, value chain tools and and services to ensure that there's uptake. Then there's active policy. So active policy, especially in public transportation, can enable uptake. By, for example, saying we're limiting, internal combustion engines for two-wheelers at this number in the city, and then the rest must be electric mobility. But that being said, there's one thing that I think from the previous question as well, to add on to what Yanni has said, is that there are many challenges. There are many climate challenges, and governments cannot fully focus on electric mobility as a priority, even though it's important to help and contribute to the climate challenge. But the industry itself has to be competitive. We get this challenge when rolling out EV in markets in Ghana, in Rwanda, in Nigeria. It has to be competitive. The customer doesn't care whether it's e-mobility runs on unicorn fuel or whatever. They just want it to be, to save them money, right? So at the end of the day, we have to innovate and ensure that it's cheap, and that's the biggest incentive for uptake, ensuring that you have ubiquitous charging stations. As much as I once interacted with an electric vehicle driver in Nairobi, a four-wheeler, and I asked him, which one do you prefer? He said, honestly, I don't really mind. And in fact, if you ask me, if you ask in terms of like driving experience, saving money, if you ask me to choose, I actually choose the internal combustion because I can get a petrol station after every 2 miles. But this one, I really, really have to look for a charging station. And then when I get there, there's a big line. And then when I charge, I can't really go out of town because supposing the battery runs out and I'm out of town, what am I going to do? So I think the biggest incentive is for the industry to, ensuring that this ubiquitous charging stations, but also that the vehicle itself is cheaper than the alternative.
Now, thank you for that. The next discussion point goes to Felix and Jeremy. What policies are required in the electric vehicle infrastructure space in most African countries to more or less fast track adoption?
Yeah, I think this really builds off how Daniel started the answer to the last question. I think from a taxation standpoint, there really needs to be a lot of tax incentives for companies to build locally. There needs to be incentives for people who are purchasing electric vehicles to be getting tax breaks. I think there needs to be support from governments in terms of bringing in infrastructure, manufacturing infrastructure here locally to ensure that it's not as expensive, and we're able to help with the rollout and ensure that we're able to provide this infrastructure to the people who really need it and really require it. I think another thing that could be very important is from the power electricity providers. If we could have specific tariffs for charging, for swapping, I think this would really make a very big impact on the adoption of EVs and the associated infrastructure.
Yeah, and I think also from that's, on a positive standpoint, it's really important, but also from a negative, in terms of decentralizing, the government has this power, in terms of increasing taxation on sort of older second-hand vehicles being imported from Japan, from Europe. There's a big opportunity to make those economically not viable. So, if the taxation and import duty is so high, anything like that, it just means that those are going to stop being brought in, and, they're going to be phased out as they sort of break down, wear and tear as naturally happens. So, policy on both sides, both in terms of incentivizing and decentivizing the ICE, especially old ICE, vehicles with non-catalytic converters, all of these things which will go a long way to improving the transition.
No, that's quite interesting. I think from experience as well, I think it's key to more or less like have a African context. Even as we try to adopt what's happening elsewhere, we need to adapt whatever we are trying to invest in the African context. I think that's quite key. Ayadi, what standards and regulations are required in the electric vehicle infrastructure space for us to fast track deployment?
You know, in Kenya, because it's such a new space, there's really no standards. So we kind of the government, when everything ramps up, the government will kind of be playing catch up in setting those standards. As you know, players in the market, what we all need to do is just make sure that whatever product we're putting out there is a quality product that you know, that's safe. Like I think Arkwright, I had them mentioning about what they have put in place that has very little downtime. All this is very important because when users you know, use the infrastructure, whatever type it is, whether it's battery swap, whether it's charging stations, they want reliability, they want something safe, they want something that's not going to damage whatever they've invested in. Because if that is not put in place, you'll find it'll set e-mobility adoption back. So yeah, in Africa right now, or in Kenya, I'll speak about Kenya right now, there's no really standards or regulations you know, that are put in place. It's the government, when it comes to the point, will really, you know, be playing catch up, and they'll be talking to players like us, like EV Charger, Arkwright, and all the other companies to be advisories on what standards should be put in place for future companies coming in.
Thank you very, very much, Yadi, for that. I think the critical barriers to adoption of electric mobility space in the African context has always been costs. Costs. That has always been the issue. So, and the problem is access to finance tends to be top of the agenda, and also lack of capacity, more or less like for most players to more or less like prepare bankable project proposals to actually access the finance. So the next question then goes to Daniel. How can we improve access to finance for the private sector in the electric vehicle infrastructure value chain in Africa? I think you're muted.
Yeah, so that's where we come into play. And what we have seen from the industry is that typically, you know, electric vehicles are very expensive. A big part of the expense comes from the battery. So we've been innovating very many models on how to offer electric vehicles in a sustainable way. And one of the models that you're finding that is close to making sense is that you really offer the chassis at close to or cheaper than the cost of the internal combustion engine. And then you partner with charging, you know, charging infrastructure companies, for example, ARC, Ride, and the others. I've seen petrol stations are also coming in to offer the charging stations. But then you give the battery to the driver at a cost where it's cheaper than the daily fuel consumption, right? We haven't gotten there yet because the daily fee that the drivers are paying on the battery is still more expensive than the daily fee for fuel. But we know that that will go down with innovation and with the rising cost of fuel. And so innovative financing solutions target offering that chassis at a cheaper price and the batteries at a daily fee that's cheaper than the cost of fuel. And we hope that we'll get there one day.
Thank you for that. I definitely think we will. I think with platforms like this, I think the future is bright for Africa in this space. I think from experience, I think the key thing that is important, especially in the African space, is sustainability. Even as we try to more or less like help out the private sector or anyone to jump into the electric mobility space, the catch is sustainability. You need to look at the entire electric mobility ecosystem and ensure that at each and every point, things will be sustainable for this generation and the next. So that said, Felix and Jeremy, what are some of the innovative business models that can help bankability of electric vehicle infrastructure? And from your experience, what do you think is lacking in terms of capacity development to ensure that players willing to more or less like have access to finance can coin bankable and robust business proposals?
Yeah, I think I'd just start by saying it's a very difficult task in Nigeria to try and get price parity with ICE bikes in terms of total cost of ownership, because the fuel prices are so incredibly low in comparison to electricity. In Nairobi, we're in some ways fortunate because we're able to be already much cheaper just from the price of a kilowatt hour versus a liter of petrol is far in our favor as an e-mobility company. So massive props to Max for doing so well in Nigeria in that context. But in that sense, what we're trying to develop and what we have developed is a semi-autonomous battery as a service model, which is not tied directly to our vehicles, but of course all of our vehicles will be compatible on that. And now, as with anything, scale is going to make your profitability far better in the long run. So what we've developed is a system that is interoperable, and anyone who wants to adopt a 48-volt system and create a bike that is compatible with 48 volts is able to utilize our batteries, our swap infrastructure, our app, if they want to partner with us. And I think, having those sort of partnerships, not everyone's going to go for 48 volts, and we're fine with that. It's the same with petrol and diesel in the ICE market. Some people are going to champion 48 volts. Some people are going to think 72 volts better because you can go further and it's going to be better for rural. But I would encourage, companies that are sort of going for the same voltage, similar systems, they can team up and link their swapping infrastructure, their charging infrastructure. It's going to make the overall unit economics far better for their battery as a service or their charging as a service. So I think that's sort of a key point. And it comes back to that very difficult chicken and egg situation. What we're trying to do is lay down as much infrastructure as we can in advance of our vehicles arriving, but that's a huge capital risk for us, of course. And it just means that we perhaps have to look at things as more of an energy investment over a longer period of time, 3, 5, 10 years, instead of a traditional investment where you're looking for 7-8% returns over the course of a year. So I think it's sort of being realistic on what the battery as a service can do, also understanding limitations, but yeah, selling it in a slightly different way also can help.
Yeah, and I think from a capacity building standpoint, as mentioned earlier, standardization would really help. I think that would limit some companies really going out investing in some of this infrastructure and then realizing a lot later that the standards have been changed and they're not able to actually use some of that infrastructure. And I think interoperability is another big thing. If there could be some sort of collaboration, I know everyone is in private industry, but some sort of collaboration either in the 48 volt space or the 72 volt space would be really good for the end users, because it would allow them to not have to pick and choose between when they're buying a vehicle, okay, I can only swap at these places, I can only charge at these places. That if you go somewhere where there's a swapping station, you'll be able to swap, you'll be able to charge, and you won't have to you take away from the anxiety or some of the apprehension that end users might have before they get into purchasing an EV.
Thank you for that, Felix and Jeremy. I think interoperability is actually key. But for us to attain that, we need to ensure that we have the right standards in place. Thank you for that. I think next we're going to have 2 questions from the audience. Feel free to either type in the chat or unmute yourself. Warren, are people free to unmute themselves or is it locked? If not, people can just type in the chat box. The first question?
Sorry, unless you see hands raised, I would prefer we just post on the chat section, unless there's a hand that's raised somewhere.
Okay, I think there's a question from Mr. Dixon. It reads, are there plans to make batteries in Kenya so that they have similar specifications as physical parameters, so that one could swap battery from any swapping station irrespective of the brand or company? It's an interesting question. I think it goes to the panelists. Who will take it up? And the next question will go to the person to ask will be Ocean One. I think let's wait for response for this first.
I'm happy to tackle this first question. I think there's companies that are looking to do battery assembly here locally. I think in terms of full battery assembly, it's slightly more difficult because of some of the standards required in terms of safety and having the proper clean rooms in order to fully assemble lithium-ion batteries or nickel or NMC batteries in a safe way. I think the capacity needs to be built, most definitely, to reduce the costs massively and ensure that we have capacity building here locally to be able to fully assemble, fully service these batteries in their lifetime, and to ensure that we're able to have more employment opportunities for people here in sub-Saharan Africa.
Thank you for that. I think the next question, I think there was a hand that was raised. Ocean Yang, feel free to ask, either type in or unmute yourself and ask. Hello? Ocean One, I don't know if you can hear me. If you don't have privileges to unmute yourself, just type your question in the chat box.
Was that? I can try and unmute them.
All right, I think there's something from Ocean One. Low voltage power distribution equipment leading up to charging stations can also be expensive and subject to approval by the power utility. In China, for example, obtaining hookup permits can be hard. Any sense of the situation in Africa? Kenya, Ghana, South Africa, Rwanda, Ethiopia, Nigeria, any part of Africa, for instance, that is leading this space?
I think I can answer that.
Yeah, proceed.
It just goes back to what I was saying before. So you see, China, they have the government has a lot of regulations. So you like what Hussein was saying. This you need permits for installation and all that. But in Kenya, because it's such a new space, there is no need for permits from power utility companies to do that. So you'll find as the adoption grows, and I think it will happen sooner than we actually think, as long as we keep having these discussions and keep pushing the movement, that the government now will come in and start putting those regulations in, and those standards and laws in place to just regulate charging infrastructure in general.
Thank you.
Sorry, just adding on to that, I think as Yadi mentioned, there's no standards. So in terms of setup, as companies, we have to reach out to private companies, come into agreements with those private companies, and use their existing permits and their existing infrastructure to set up some of these charging points. So I think as we move forward and more of these swapping stations start to show up, I think the government will kind of be forced to create those regulations and have to put permits in place for people to set up.
Thank you for that. I see quite a lot of questions in the chat box. I think we won't be able to respond to all of them, but I think later on we can send our responses through the space. I think just share your email address with your question, then we can respond to it afterwards. I think we're running a bit late somehow. So the next couple of minutes, we'll more or less discuss the poll questions that were raised. We'll look at two to be specific. This goes to the panelists. How can government, development partners, and private sector stakeholders build an enabling ecosystem for electric vehicle charging infrastructure in Africa? That's the first one. Then the next one that we'll look at is, with the global north imposing a ban on ICE vehicles, will Africa be a dumping ground? How can Africa prepare for this in the EV charging infrastructure space? I think a minute each a minute each from the panelists. Then thereafter we can.
Just on the first one, I think it's really important having associations such as IAMDA actually presenting a unified voice, because if it's ArcRide speaking with the government, then how are other companies going to be ensured that they're speaking on behalf of their interests as well? So having something which presents a compiled group of industry players to the government, that's a much more powerful story.
Yeah, and in terms of Africa becoming a dumping ground, I think this again comes down to regulation. I think the ban of imports of ICE vehicles that are older than a certain number of years, incentivizing people to switch or purchase EV vehicles, preferably locally assembled ones, would be one of the ways to mitigate that.
No, thank you very much. I think for now, I think that covers the responses aligned to the poll questions. There's so much insights, and I wish this session was longer than an hour. Yeah, it just keeps on getting better. I think at this point in time, I'll hand over to Warren, more or less like just to summarize on the learning points and also closing remarks. Warren, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thanks again, Kumbuso. Thanks, Daniel, Iadi, Felix, and Jeremy for giving us such deep insights around the charging infrastructure landscape across the continent. I think even as we were discussing the chicken and egg scenario where charging infrastructure or electric vehicles, what needs to come first, it's going to be a blend of both, where investments need to come from both sides, even innovations, because you, as the panel, you have expertise in both setting up the charging infrastructure as well as deploying these vehicles on the road. So it's going to call on partnerships between companies, between the private sector and the public sector and other development partners to ensure that there's uptake of the vehicles. Because remember, again, at the end of the day, it's serving a consumer need, and we need to serve that as the most cost-efficient point, while also being sustainable for our environment, as has been mentioned. So once more, I'd like to pass a great thanks to all of you who managed to make it for the session. This was around charging infrastructure and the lessons that can be pulled out of it. The next session will be focused around standards, and we'll have another exciting panel who will be joining in a minute. So we thank you all, and a special thanks to our event partners and supporters. I'd still like to mention them. That's EV Charger, who's rightfully on the panel. Thank you, Iadi. Untapped, the Waterfront Mall, the United Nations Environment Program, Bile Group through UTU, the Standard Group, Absa Bank, KNCCI, and the World Resources Institute. Thank you for the ongoing support, and we look forward to an even bigger event next year.